Good evening and welcome to Dia Chelsea. My name is Humberto Moro and I'm Deputy Director of Program here at Dia. And I have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's program to mark the launch of our newest publication, Joan Jonas' Next Move in a Mirror World. We are truly honored to have Joan here with us tonight, where she will be joined in conversation by our esteemed colleagues and contributors to the book, curator Adrienne Edwards and scholar Heather Davis. Now, before saying a bit more about the publication, I want to take this opportunity to thank our speakers for being here to share with us, as well as the editors of the book who brought it to fruition, Barbara Clausen, Christine Poor, and Kelly Kipland. I also want to acknowledge the team here at DIA who supported the book, including Jordan Carter, Camilla Foreman, Sophia Larigakis, Molly Bernstein, Deirdre Doyer, and Laura Fields, and those who made tonight's event possible, Emily Markert, Kim Golding, and Max Tanon. Joan Jonas' Next Move in a Mirror World is a monograph featuring new scholarship on Jonas's multimedia installations and performance practice from the early 70s to the present. It is inspired by the format of a reader, and it breaks new ground by contextualizing and expanding understandings of Jonas's body of work through three thematic approaches: the critical notions of gender, being, and otherness, the politics of landscape and ecology, and new conceptions of medium specificity and unspecificity. It is richly illustrated with never-before published sketches and drawings, and it includes an interview with the late Douglas Crimp and a personal reflection by Jonas's on their enduring friendship. Next Move in a Mirror World is published in conjunction with the first major U.S. museum show of Jonas's art in nearly 15 years, which was on view in the lower level of Dia Beacon until last March, and which I hope many of you had the opportunity to see. Even if you did not, throughout tonight's talk, images from the exhibition will be visible on the screen to help us situate and contextualize the dialogue as Heather and Adrienne speak with Joan about some of the themes explored in the publication as well as the exhibition. With that, I will turn over to our speakers, so please join me in welcoming Adrienne Edwards, Heather Davis, and Joan Jonas.
Hi, good evening. What a nice crowd. And on summer solstice, that's how special you are, Joan. I first also want to extend my thanks to Kelly, Kristen, and Barbara. What you all don't see is that we did almost like seminars. I mean, it wasn't just like, hi, can you write these many words and have it to us by this day? It was like, no, we're going to sit down and actually go through your ideas with you. So we did these presentations that were really incredibly rigorous, and I want to thank you for that thoughtful process, because the result is an extraordinary book that we're lucky to be in. One of the things I wanted to maybe kick off this conversation with asking Joan is, I was finding myself thinking about Dia as a context for your work. And I mean, we can go to the website and look at Dia's history, and you'll see that is, and many of you probably already know, deeply committed to minimalism, to things like land art, conceptualism. And I thought to myself, Joan is kind of like, the work is conceptual in terms of idea-driven, but Joan's work is like decidedly lush, fairly, actually I would say maximalist in a certain kind of way. So what is it like for you to have had this kind of support And because you've shown here multiple times in different projects and commissions, but also now this extraordinary show that you had, what does it mean to situate it in the history of DIA?
Well, I'll quickly say that when DIA opened in where it was up there, up in New York State, my first impression was, oh, this is so, what can I say, strict and so formal. I mean, my very first reaction was that I would have wanted that. Not that I thought of myself ever being there, but for me it was, if I look back on your question, I never thought of this before, I never said it, but it's a thrill to be in the DIA collection and to be in that beautiful space up there. I began when Lynn Cook was the curator, and they asked me to do this piece before it opened. And then it was a delay of a few years. So I had a lot of time to spend in that space and to photograph it, which I include in the piece, to photograph the unrenovated factory spaces of DIA. It was a biscuit factory. And so it was a very natural entrance, you know, from that time of beginning. And I'll just say that the space is a thrilling space to work in. And that's really what I concentrated on. And I was thrilled to be in that space, and it's changed since then quite a bit from those early days of minimalism. So I think, speaking now here, I can only say that I'm very happy about the fact that it came back there. And the space itself is what I've always been interested in, the space of my installations, and that is a particularly beautiful space. And so for me, I'm just sort of thrilled to be in that space, to have been. I also want to say thank you to DIA, to Jessica, and to Barbara Clausen, and to Kristen Poor, and Field, the woman who designed the book. Sorry, Laura Field, and to Kelly Kivlin. I just wanted to say quickly thank you.
Yeah, maybe just to follow up on Adrienne's question, one of the things that we were both remarking upon earlier was that, you know, there's a lot of people probably after your really important practice who are performance artists who then translate that performance into some kind of installation. And in your work, you do it in a very specific kind of way. And what's really remarkable about this particular exhibition is the translation of the pieces, specifically the shape, the scent, the feel of things, which was performed in that space, and then reimagined as this installation many years later. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, what you bring with you from that performance and what gets left behind, and how you make those decisions, and how you're thinking about the audience and their impact.
Well, I mainly thought in that case of the audience walking into it and through it. When I made it at DIA Viken, I thought of the space itself representing the mental hospital that it was about, Abbey Warburg, that Warburg was in this long column. So I used the columns, the corridors in the original performance, and the audience sat in bleachers at one end, and I thought of them as the doctors who were listening to Warburg's declaration of sanity in a certain sense. And then when I went back to do it again, and then when I showed it, I think I showed it in a different version right after that, I took it apart. Now, I'll just say that my work for me is not, I wouldn't say the first way to describe it is translating a performance, although I say that all the time, of course. But installation is a form. You know, it's not just, the word installation has no meaning unless you define it in a certain way. For me, it's the form of my work. And so the installation is made in relation to the space, deconstructing the piece. So I took the piece apart, and there's certain parts of it in the videos that I separated out and had them as projections. For the DIA piece this time, I added one projection of Salton Sea, which you mentioned, because I think it's an important part of the piece. Salton Sea represents to me, and the area of California, where the ruins of the casino or whatever. I can't remember the name of it now. It's a very famous architect who did that, but it's in ruins now. For me, in relation to Warburg, that represented America decay. And so then Kate Fenner sang the Woody Guthrie song in front of that projection of the Salton Sea, The Pastures of Plenty, which is a very hopeful and beautiful song. But against that, to me, I like the irony. I don't know if that answers your question, but anyway, so that, I added that because I thought it was a very important part. And then to have that big space, I just moved parts around, thinking of, not of the audience coming and sitting in a fixed place, but of them entering into the piece and moving around in the space.
I kind of want to circle back around this idea, Joan, actually, because I feel like it's happening. This show exemplifies it. I think the show you did at Gavin Brown in 2017 exemplified it. But there is this kind of layering that actually happens in the exhibition experience. On one level, you have the work, some that you have broken apart, I kind of love that idea, and reimagined. Those translations or transmissions, as you've called them over the years, are one way of staging the work of art, or in which the work of art is staged for an experience or for an encounter. But then I think there's another layer where what happens when all of those things sit together in a show? And I obsess about this. I mean, not just because I work in interdisciplinary art and performance, but as someone who has thought about the form, has thought about it so rigorously, I am really intrigued by how you are doing all of these things at the same time. The experience of the staging is itself layered. And I think it is so true to the forms, I should say, plural, themselves, that it actually makes it felicitous, meaning it's pleasing to me, it's convincing as an aesthetic experience. So I'm curious about like how performance exhibitions often, or exhibitions about performance, or exhibitions that are tried to deal with liveness, or the fact that there had been liveness. I could just unfold this endlessly, right? So you can see like the complexity of it. Often fail because they are not true to the thing itself. What was your process? What was the moment of realization of how to tackle this in your work? And how did you do it at the level of the individual work of art, but then at a higher level of then telling the story of what your art making has been about?
Complicated question. Let me think. First of all, I'll just say how I began to think about that was in the early 70s. You know, you do a performance and spend a year on it, and 100 people would come. And to me, that's just not enough. That's just one small part of the thinking. I wanted more people, I wanted more people to see the work. And so when I was offered a show at the Stedelijk in Amsterdam to show my work, that was the first time I translated performances into installations. And a lot of people said, oh, I miss the liveness, you know. Of course, that first time, they missed the liveness. I don't know if they still miss it, but particularly the shape, the scent, the feel things, I re-edit pieces. I don't show them at all the way they were when I perform them. I re-edit the material, I rearrange. I don't make necessarily new things, but I re-edit it and rearrange it. Now, how can I answer your question?
Okay, so that's happening at the level of the individual work of art. You build actually like installations around them. So it's almost like there's this idea, but then you build a world around that idea, and it's in video, and it's in sculpture, and it's in drawing, and it's all of these different things. So I think you've illuminated how you do that. Then what does it mean to then put all those things together to tell the story of your making? Like, how did you think about not just the space, but how you place things in relationship to one another? Like, what was meaningful to you about like constellating things?
I have to say, I don't have a deep answer for that, but I can say that it's about rearranging, it's about walking around a lot in the space and thinking of all the elements and what goes where. And it's about improvisation, which becomes the actual piece itself. And in the case of Dia, it's just not just the shape, the feel of things in that installation. It was also a piece called Stage Sets that I made in '76. And then Dia had these pieces. And then the circles of cones, one of them was called After Mirage. It was kind of great to deal with that situation and put those three works in the same space with the shape, the set, and feel of things, which I edited and showed as a video. Because the other element in that was Jason Moran's music. And I wanted Jason to be part of it, of course. And he's in the performance. And in the performance, he plays live. He wouldn't do that in this situation. He came to the opening and played live. But so for me, it's a matter of I can't explain it. It's just, these layers are in my head like we all have, and we're all thinking of more than one thing at once. And so from the very beginning, I didn't want to just do performance. I wanted to, from the very beginning, I thought of drawing, video, film, performance, all the elements coming together into this language, because I was reacting, speaking of Dia, I was reacting against that minimalism. I was reacting against what I saw the first time I went to Dia, where I thought it was a little bit too, it was wonderful, they're all wonderful art, brilliant. But for me, I needed something different, and that was my main purpose in developing what I call a language, whatever, I don't know.
So good. Can you say a little bit more about what you call language? And the reason I want to ask this is because I was thinking about like narrative or storytelling in your work, and I realized that the storytelling happens also on multiple levels, which is kind of how I was backing out into the like experience in my body and in the show. What I mean by that is within these different elements you put together, whether it's video or whether it's costuming or whatever it is, the sculptures, the mirrors, I almost feel like each of them each of the elements are like words, or just to put it at the level of language, or like a symbol, but it functions to tell the narrative. They're almost like storytelling bits, if you will. I think that's good enough for now. But yeah, but that they function together to kind of, so the narrative is happening in a movement, right?
Well, I'm not a writer, although I do write, but I'm a visual person. And so it's what I can't say in words, really. I would not want to explain to you in words what the piece means. I want people to really absorb it and look at it and take it in. Of course, there are words that could explain it, and I do talk about it. But as far as the idea of language, I remember when I started using the word language, people would say, "Oh, it's not a language." It's not really language. But for me, it's language. It's a visual language that, please excuse me while I use the visual language. But now, so many, I'm not the only one in the world doing that. There's so many languages that don't require words that we learn from and watch. I don't know how to say.
That's great, Joan. I mean, I could ask a follow-up, but I will stop hogging the mic.
One of the other things that I was really thinking about as you guys were both talking, and one of the things I've always been so drawn to in your work is like in the, Adrienne, you said it so gorgeously, the kind of liveness that happens in the installation setting, which is, I think, incredibly unusual. There's like a sense of kind of electricity or vibrancy. I mean, in this show, there's like literal electricity, but in addition to that, there's that kind of a feeling, and it really reminds me both of something that I personally hold dear about kind of feminist practice, which is that there's an appeal, I think, in the best kind of versions of feminist practice to a certain kind of openness to revision, right? An openness to both kind of returning to earlier pieces or earlier moments and rethinking, reimagining them for different contexts, for kind of bringing in whatever histories or stories have kind of happened in the interim. And I really see that in your work, like the ways in which, I know that Dia had these works, but, you're reimagining both after Mirage and stage sets, as well as the shape, the scent, the feel of things in this exhibition with this like fairly large gap in time. And I'm wondering, as you're kind of doing that, what kinds of reimaginings or revisions are you bringing with you? Because I think for me it's like both such an incredibly important feminist practice to kind of be open to that kind of recursiveness and to really think. I think in so much of your work there's this kind of incredible kind of insistence upon the non-linearity of time, right, and the ways in which the temporal has so many different kinds of registers that we could think about as a kind of cyclicalness, but I think that there's something maybe slightly more complicated happening in those revisionings or in that kind of re-inhabitation. But I also see it somewhat as a political gesture, like maybe more explicitly as a political gesture to really think about different states of the world at different moments in time. I'm more curious if that comes into your thinking as you're re-encountering your work and re-engaging with it.
Well, maybe during the late 60s, early 70s, in relation to feminism, I thought of that word more often than I do now. I think after a while you don't have to have these words as part of your vocabulary, and like the idea of it's just there, and sometimes not there. But I don't set out in the same way that but in the late 60s, early 70s, there was very much of a thinking about feminism in a political way. And Organic Honey was about that. But I wasn't interested in making a political work, but I did want to make a work about that. In the early days, my pieces were simpler, and it was more convenient. I could do a piece and then do it again and change it, because I did my pieces over and over again, and then I wouldn't be happy with it. I would want to change it and make it better. I don't know if it was ever better. I could tell stories about that, but I won't. But anyway, and then now, say the piece Reanimation that I would do with Jason, or that piece, The Shape, the Scent, the Feel of Things, you cannot change it without rehearsing it. And to put on one of those performances, there's no time for rehearsing anything new. You can only get it together in the best way possible, as it was in that situation. Of course, there's small changes. It's like theater in general. There's always something that's normal. But when I do a new piece, I go back for inspiration, I was saying, to several, like Mirage is a piece I always went back to, because it's an open form, and I could take it apart. And I liked the form of that, but I never did anything that looked like it. But I thought of the form of Mirage, and the same with other pieces. And I also go back to No drama, the Japanese drama, which has influenced me a lot. And I have a book of no plays. So I'm inspired by certain, when you begin, you think, oh my God, what am I going to do now? So you need to go certain places to find a way, or you have a subject matter. I don't know. I've talked enough. I don't know if that answers you.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the other things I was thinking about, and in your answer, I think it really comes out as well, is that there's something almost evolutionary in terms of the kind of branching and morphing of the different pieces, right? And the ways in which they're kind of informing each other and not at the same time. And I think there's something incredibly interesting about that, and not thinking about it in that kind of, social Darwinist evolutionary way, but in the way in which somebody like Lynn Margulis would think about.
I'll break in by saying that the cone, which was in this piece, and it's a form I've used many times. I mean, I first thought of the cone a long time ago in the early 70s as a shape that I wanted to explore. I would think, I'm going to start now with the idea of a cone, and then that led to the paper cones, the tin cones, and then continuously refining the tin cones, and I love to use them over and over again. I would go back and use cones again for sure. But and then the Dia Beacon piece, stage sets, which was a piece I did in '76. It was wonderful to have that again. I'll just say that for the kind of work I do, to have it put up is a miracle. Because, it's all folded up in a little space somewhere, and then you put it up and it exists. It doesn't exist in the same way. But for stage sets, which was made out of many elements of my work, cones, chairs, elements of earlier works, my friend Jan, what's his name? Jan? The lighting designer, my friend. Kroza. My friend Jan Kroza, he is also a friend. He's a lighting designer, and he's brilliant. He lit the piece at Dia, and he did, of course, a magical job. And so that turns it into something else. And he lit the stage sets, and I'll never forget, he made a shadow on the floor underneath the paper roof, and so he made a unit, So those things happen too.
I really want to get you to talk about theater. So you mentioned no theater as something that has been deeply influential. Are there other theatrical forms? Do you go to the theater, Joan? Do you think about, how much are you riffing or thinking about in relationship to theater?
I never was in theater. I never did theater. I love theater. It's like I love film. But theater for me was something. The Worcester Group was I was very close to them at one point, many years ago, when I performed in their work. I like that theater because it's so going against theater, going against certain theatrical forms. And it's another, when I think of, you mentioned in your essay that I think of a line, and there's performance at this end and theater at that. And I go back and forth on that line, and I incorporate theatrical elements, we could say, like lighting. Like people who are purist about performance would maybe criticize the use of theatrical devices. But for instance, this actress, this is just an example, I'm very interested in acting and actors and the way they perform. So Glenda Jackson just died, and so I immediately watched Elizabeth R. that she did when she was very young. I recommend it. And I really enjoy watching that kind of theater. That is pure theater, of an actress. I'm not an actress. I don't use emotions. I represent. I'm a performer. Does that answer?
Yeah, it does. And yet, I feel like, I don't know, there's something to the showing of a doing. Maybe you could talk a little bit about no. And the reason I want to track this thing with theater is because, and I'm glad you mentioned the Worcester Group, which had been the performance garage before. And at that moment, right, like the late 60s, the early 70s, we get to experimental theater through the mining of all kinds of things, all kinds of cultural, all kinds of forms that are things like no theater, indigenous dance. It's coming from all these places, so that what indexes, I'm thinking about Steve Reich and like what it meant for Steve to be exploring West African percussion, etc. So we break the Western form, to get back to the word you use about breaking things down, through these other explorations into other sort of artistic sensibilities. So know this kind of, because they like do it all in front of the audience. It's also extremely durational. And the way that we think about performance in a place like a museum or an installation in a museum, the fact that it has to be put on museum time is the way we often think about it, when in fact, there are already performances and styles of performances that are extraordinarily durational, right? You could be there for days. So what does no give to you?
Well, I just read your essay again, and you mentioned anthropology. So from the very beginning, I'm not an anthropologist, but from the very beginning, when I began even to do anything, I was looking at everything I could look at. Like there was the Hopi snake dance. I heard about it. I went to the Southwest to see it. Of course, I never used that. It's indigenous. It's not my thing to use, but you can imagine the effect. It's an amazing ritual. And that's just one example of looking at other cultures from the very beginning and thinking of ritual. You wanted to ask. I said, please don't ask me about ritual. But so I saw my work as a kind of ritual in this context in New York, with me just sitting here for my little audience at that time would come and watch my ritual of, making a drawing or whatever. And so I called them rituals. The No Theater, which I saw in 1970, I went to Japan, and the No Theater is a visual, it's a dance, really, because it's theater, and it is what I was looking for, actually, a musical form, because it's dance, language, costume, props, movement, it's everything together. And so in other cultures, they have that form of theater. I was never interested in my theater in this country. I can't do it, like Hamlet, or of course I go to see Hamlet, and I'm going to see a lot of productions of Shakespeare, but it's not my thing to go into that kind of language-based theater. In the No drama, of course, I can't understand what they're talking about. But, you sit there with the libretto and you read the story, so you know a little bit what it's about, but it's not the same kind of linear storytelling that we have. So that was my reason for being so attracted to the No. And the use of props, and the kabuki, they use little pieces of paper, and they create illusions with pieces of wood, and they have little structures made out of sticks. I really like that. It really spoke to me.
No, I really am curious about the ways in which, you think about ritual in relationship to your work. I know that you only think about it in particular kinds of situations and not in others. But I think that what is fascinating about the ways in which you go about doing performance, and you describe this as you don't just get up and do a performance, right? It is this very kind of set up stage-like thing where you're bringing in all of these specific kinds of elements, right? That have all of the things that we've been talking about, right? That have these elements of cones that are reappearing, or shapes that are reappearing, drawings that are being done in a particular kind of way. There is this the very kind of highly specific visual language that you've developed over the course of your career, and I'm curious about how where you kind of situate that kind of aspect of ritual in your work. What to you does feel like a ritual and what doesn't anymore? What are because I do think it's a very compelling way to think through how you think about what the kind of function of performance is, the function of that kind of contemporary art, right? And the seeming kind of evacuation of certain kinds of rituals from modern Western European, American culture, right? Like that even though I don't think that we actually have evacuated rituals, there's maybe not the explicitness of them in the way that the other cultures have kind of held on to those things is incredibly valuable. And I think it's really interesting the ways in which you're grappling with that notion. And so I'm wondering, like, where are the moments where you're kind of working with that sense of ritual? Where are you pushing back against it?
I don't think about my work as ritual anymore, because after a certain point, I did a lot of research of shamanism, and also other cultures. Shamanism is something that really interests me, but I never wanted to directly identify with that because I didn't think it was maybe appropriate, but it's part of the work. I never think about shamanism anymore. I mean, of course I do, but it's not my language. When I go into a work, I don't have to I've thought about all those things, and they've just become part of me, of my thinking, without me naming them, without me separating them all out. But when I was looking at all of them and studying them, it's just simply I was inspired by work from other cultures. I didn't want to, like, when I began, there was a lot of interest in autobiography. I never wanted to work with autobiography about me. I never wanted to be Joan Jonas. I wanted to be something else. So it was organic honey, or it was Icelandic salt. It was different, entering into other worlds. And I could say in general, it's all about storytelling in different ways. I mean, I'm trying to think about how to look at the work over the years, and to me that's a way to look at it. But storytelling is a very complex and varied method by different, depending on where you are. So my storytelling is not like Virginia Woolf telling a story, although, no, I love Virginia Woolf, but I was just recently thinking of doing something with her writing, and then I think, oh no, we've done so much Virginia Woolf. Anyway, she's amazing, but I don't know if that answers your question. I'm sort of trying to, ritual is not like, because we've had this conversation, I might think about it now, because I'm just beginning a new piece, actually with a dancer. I won't mention it now. She might be here. But anyway, I'm thinking of a new piece, and I think the word ritual is a good way to begin, but not to be the emphasis. It's going to disappear in the audience maybe won't see it as a ritual. It's not a ritual, it's a performance anymore. But ritual was what enabled me. The idea of ritual of other cultures and me having a ritual which was very simple, lying on the floor, kicking my heels, or whatever. That was a very simple way for me to get into it, because I began with no knowledge of performance or theater. I never had any experience. So it was a terrifying experience, actually. Yeah. I was just reading, speaking of Glenda Jackson, sorry, but she said she was always terrified to go on the stage. It says so in all the obituaries. And that interests me to hear somebody like that being still terrified, Yeah. And I was very scared at the very beginning, and you gradually get over that. So then you go and you do a repetitive gesture, and gradually the fear goes away. That doesn't answer your question, but it says a little bit.
Yeah, I think it does.
I have a question, Joan, about what happens in relationship to this question about ritual or indexing the self or indexing you in the work. Because there's a moment where the masks go away. And there's also a moment, I'm going to forget the name of the piece, but Kristen or Barbara can help me here, where you actually do appear quite directly in your home, in a piece, that makes me think about ritual in its kind of everydayness, like good night, good morning, that's it. You are, and you would be winning.
Should we mention the good night, good morning?
Yeah, why don't you describe it?
No, I just want to say, Jessica, the curator for MoMA. What's her name?
Oh, Anna.
She's here. I mean, Good Night, Good Morning is the title of the show at MoMA.
Oh, is it? Oh, smart,
Thank you to Anna.
I like it.
So what was your question? Sorry.
My question is really about the fact that I feel like you've shifted from something that is ritual, maybe, to something that is, maybe I could say, self-reflexive.
Definitely.
And what got you there? Like from
well, I mean, I gradually, I began with the masks because I wanted to cover my face, one thing. I wanted to be someone else. I didn't want to be Joan Jonas, so I used masks. I couldn't control my face. You know, actors have a tremendous control over their expressions and I had no control. So like I was, you know, behind the mask. And then gradually, on one level, I got over that. And then people would say to me, why don't you take off the mask? There's a song actually says, take off your mask. You know that song? That's all that I ask you to do. Put back the mask. Anyway. So, yeah, with the Good Night, Good Morning, I did the first Good Night, Good Morning was the truest. It was in the 70s, black and white, Portapac, getting up in the morning and saying good night at night to the camera, getting up and saying good morning to the camera. In my, you know, whatever I had on or didn't have on, hidden, of course, but there. And then when I did that second one that you're talking about, I think that you're referring to, it's much more arty. I mean, I have to say, I don't think it's as good. It's much more arty. It's about me setting up a situation and, you know, is the camera in the right? I did it in my house in Canada. I mean, it was actually Pat Steer said to me, why don't you do another one? And so that's one of the reasons some of my friends sometimes say things like that. So I did another Good Night, Good Morning. But I like it, it's okay. But I think the first one is the real one. They're related, and it just shows you a certain kind of transition. But that's, you know, part of that being real, in a way.
There's this other moment where that you describe. This is really jumping ahead in time. Sorry, but you know, in your recent work, and especially in Moving Off the Land, the first one and then the second, you know, you describe the way in which, I think it was in an interview with Kristen, where you're describing the ways in which you felt like you kind of merged with those creatures in a way that you hadn't in kind of like previous performances. And so I'm curious about that as another kind of like, not exactly self-reflexive moment. It was more like a maybe an immersive moment, but how you came to, I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about like, how did you, what was that turn in your work towards the more explicitly environmental, and then what did it mean for you to have that kind of quality of immersion with these like really extraordinary, you know, there's these gorgeous scenes of you kind of like dancing with seals, and it really feels like you're in that water with them, you know. So I'm just wondering if you could describe. I mean,
all these things happen gradually. You know, you begin with a small part, and then it gradually develops. And I think for anybody who does performance or dance knows that you become partially transformed in the act of performing, and time loses its meaning, in a way. If it's a terrible performance, it's like torturous time, you know. But anyway, so in relation to your question, I'll just, you know, the piece, I was inspired by Haldor Laxness in the very beginning of those pieces about the glaciers melting. You know, he wrote a book called Under the Glacier. When I began to work on that piece, I thought, oh, the glaciers are melting. It's not the same thing. He wrote the book in the 60s. So I had to take that, and that was how I began to think, oh, the glaciers are melting, and that's what's happening. And so it began that way. And then gradually, the glaciers melt, the sea is around us, they're creatures. And working in that situation, running back and forth, trying to follow the seals. I was trying to follow them. And it's never happened to me before. That's why you're mentioning, because I said that. It's never happened to me before. I worked in projections that I felt afterwards transformed, that I felt part of that, I was in the water with the seals. I can't explain it, and it probably spoils it to talk about it too much, but it was the first time that's ever happened to me. And so it was a special moment. And it hasn't happened since, because I haven't done that piece yet for a long time. And it doesn't happen with other works, you know. It's something about the movement, the continuous repetition, and then being in that world, and then having worked with those, you know, working with fish, going to aquariums and looking at fish for several years, working with David Gruber, marine biologist. So all of that came together.
I think now's a good moment to open it up for questions to the audience.
I wanted to just take a moment where you mentioned about with repetitive movement, the fear goes away in performance. And I wanted to just hear you speak about performance or repetition in performance, but then also repetition as a part of your practice, whether it's drawing or repetition of forms, the cone, the mirror, and if you use repetition as an entry point to release fear, but also as an entry point to create something new out of the work that you've already made.
Well, needless to say, repetition is part of a musical language. Repetition is part of so many practices. And repetition itself, in some ways, if you repeat something over and over again, it alters it. And you can go into, you know, you enter a process, and the rhythm can change. So repetition itself can transform your ideas and actions. And in my case, you know, I'm going to start a new work now. I look back at my old work, and I think, what can I do? I don't have any new ideas. So what can I do? How can I bring parts of my practice into this new work? So I think of all the actions that I trust myself doing that I could begin with, and drawing is one of them. I'm very, it's a part of my work that I'm interested in how to, the drawing exists in the performance differently from the way it exists in my studio. Say I make a drawing in my studio, that's a very different process from making a drawing in a performance. In the performance, it's not about control, it's about letting go and opening up and letting whatever happens happen. So for me, it's an unknown. So you go into that, you don't know what's going to happen. And you don't know I never know what the image is exactly going to look like, of course. On the other hand, I have used, you spoke about appropriation too. I keep looking to her essay. Anyway, appropriation. If I appropriate something, really, I give it credit. Like the one thing I did appropriate, I'm influenced by things and I bring them into the work, but they're not quotes. And so, but one quote I did make and appropriate was from a book of spiritual disciplines, the Malukian Book of the Dead. It's a tribe in New Guinea, and they make this drawing called, I call it the endless drawing. I'm not sure that they make that distinction, that name. But the story is that when you die, you go to the border between life and death, and you meet the devouring witch. And the witch makes a line in the sand and begins a drawing. And in order for you to get into the next life, you have to complete the drawing. So these are beautiful drawings, and they're made on grids. And I copied them. And I made them, I did one in organic honey a long time ago, because they're beautiful performative things. You make a grid, and then you do a continuous line that loops all the way through the grid and to the other corner. They're amazing, but I always give them credit, but that's a ritual drawing that I use, that I don't do it anymore. I tried, actually, recently, and it was so hard. You know, it's not easy to make that drawing. I tried, but I couldn't. I mean, that's the other thing that happens to me. I can go back to something, try to do it, but I can't. I mean, does that answer your question at all?
Hey, Joan. Hey, I had a question about images and specifically like the physicality of video. And I'm wondering if throughout your career, what you've thought about working with projected video versus video on monitors. So I know that you've had like a lot of different experiences with like single channel, multi-channel, but also the way that like working with large scale projected images can completely take over a space, or how having something small on a monitor but with really loud sound has a different effect. So I'm just wondering if you could talk some about your process and how you figure out the way that you show your moving image work.
Well, I mean, now I mostly work with big projections now. I want the audience to be able to, I mean, if you have a monitor or a flat screen, you put it in a small room so that people can see it. But if you have a big audience, like for this audience, I would have a projection of something, but I would make it for that situation now. I wouldn't make it for a monitor. I mean, we don't even have monitors anymore. We do have small ways. We do have ways of showing video. Like in the show at MoMA now, there's several project installations that I really like that are about small things around the room. Or for instance, Dara Birnbaum's piece that involves a structure that holds the video monitors, which is fantastic. So I don't do that kind of work right now, although you never know. But that's the way I don't know how to explain what I think about. I think about it as a natural form that I can use and stand inside of it and work in relation to it on my body. You know, we mentioned the word body, but my body, I like it to become part of the background and interact with the background of the video. So the video, eventually I might design it to be shown by itself, but the video exists in the beginning as a veil for my body.
Joan, I'm just curious, having watched many people now go through the work at DIA, you know, how you think about the visitor in your work. Because people wander in so many different directions. I've seen people go from one end to the other and then come back. And of course, they always go to the Coyote. That's very popular. But how do you think about that? Or do you feel there's no control and you put out what you put out? So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I wouldn't put the word control into it because I do have no control of how the audience walks through my work. I have no control of how they see my work. When you're sitting there, I have no control of what you're thinking. You know, everybody has different associations with what they see, and so that I have no control over. In this particular case of DIA, the installation there, I wanted to do it very differently from the way it had been done. I did the performance in that same space, and so it was really interesting to go back to that space and reimagine. I didn't want to show just the video of the performance at some far end of the room. I wanted to inhabit the space and translate that whole situation. So the way I work is I walk into a space and I think, how does it look from here? And then I walk to the other end and I say, how does it look from here? And then over there, how does it look from here? And I do think of arranging the projections and the objects in a way and related to how I want to inhabit the space. I don't know, it's hard to put that all in words, but yeah, I don't think of controlling the audience, but I do think, like in Dia Beacon, first thing you do is you look down those long corridors and then you think, how does something look over there? I mean, you don't want it to be symmetrical. And then another projection over there, and then you have the columns to deal with. So you have to deal with arranging around the architectural elements. And that's, I mean, I could say my mother changed the furniture all the time in my house growing up, and I feel related to that a little bit.
You touched on the idea of rehearsal earlier. You were saying when restaging work, sometimes there's not time. So it sounds like with new work, rehearsal plays a role in decision making. And specifically in the Dia piece, I was wondering how much does rehearsal play?
I could just say,
take us through.
in the Dia Beekman, the piece, the shape, the scent, and feel of things, Jason Moran and I went up there we were given the whole summer to rehearse and to develop the piece, I must say. Jason and I went up there 5 days a week, the whole summer. It was wonderful, I have to say. And Jason said he never worked so hard in his life. He was very young. He was very young and amazing. And so rehearsal is absolutely necessary. I mean, one can improvise, but for myself, better to rehearse and, be ready. No, but so in that case, what I brought to that was the projections and the script that I'd taken from the Warburg writings and a kind of order. And, I work with other people, so like my friend Sakina Gavigan helped me with a script, for instance. So anyway, so when Jason came, what we had to develop was the movement and the music. And so we worked every day. We'd start with one scene, the projection, the script, and then Jason would experiment and play something. And I would say, yes, no, I like it, no, not quite right. And so we went through the whole piece like that, choosing the music, developing the music, and then I reacted to Jason's music. So I ran around reacting to his music. In other words, making movements that were inspired. Music inspires me, I have to say. So right now I would not want to do something without rehearsing it at all. I have to say, rehearsing is part of the process. It's part of the when you say rehearse, it's not rehearsing something you already know. The rehearsal process is also the development of the piece. And the only time you have to develop it is when you've got everybody together for the rehearsal.
Just in that question about control, I was wondering about your use of mirrors, which seems like a medium that does inherently call attention to how the audience is perceiving the work. I just would love to hear more from you about that.
Oh, sorry, what's the question about control, about
Just
what?
In thinking about the audience's experiences of perceiving the work, curious how mirrors fall into that conversation.
So anyway, one of my main interests when I began was how the perception, the audience's perception, what do they perceive? And my idea was to change their perception, have them see something and have it alter their perception. So with the mirror pieces, if you look at the mirrors, I would have them, a lot of rehearsal of people carrying mirrors around in a space and I sitting there and saying, okay, that works, that doesn't work, that works. But I wanted to alter the experience of the audience. And the mirrors moving in the space, it's like the vertical roll, this thing that comes down like this in the monitor. After a while, the room begins to rise. It alters your perception. It alters your way of seeing. And so that's one thing that interests me. And I was much more involved in that in the early days than I am now. But I suppose it's still about perception, and so the mirror pieces are highly, all my pieces are like that, but carrying the mirrors has to be done in a very specific way. They have to move in specific patterns. They have to move slowly. If they move too fast, the reflection doesn't work. And the audience is reflected in the mirrors. And that interests me because for people to be looking at themselves in the mirror, they're sitting in an audience and everybody can see you looking at yourself. It makes them uneasy, and that interests me. So there are all these different ways of thinking about it, about that.
I think we will wrap it there. Thank you so much, Heather, Adrienne, Joan, for this beautiful conversation.